Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will learn how to search for a keyword phrase within our custom query that is powering our new API URL. Let me show you what I mean. So in our previous lesson, we worked on this new custom URL, WP-JSON University v1 search. And at the moment, just as a test, we are returning all professor post types. But that's not what we actually want. We want to be able to search for a phrase. So for example, if someone comes to our website and searches for barks a lot, well, then we would only want to return the Dr. Barks a Lot post. Alright, and the first step towards making that happen is for us to revisit the custom query that we wrote that is responsible for getting this data. Let me show you what I mean. So right now, let's jump into our text editor. And within our theme folder's INC or includes folder, let's open up searchroute.php. And down here, we see our WP query object named professors. And at the moment, we haven't been very specific with this query. We're just saying give us any posts where the post type equals professor. But why don't we go ahead and get a bit more specific with this query? So at the end of this line, we can add a comma, and then we are free to add on another argument. You might remember from previous lessons arguments like posts per page and order by or meta query. Well, right now I want to introduce you to a new argument that we can pass on to the WP query class. So on this line, let's give it a new argument of simply S. S stands for search. And we can set this to equal whatever we want. So just as a test, let's set it to barks a lot. Or if you named your professor something else, just choose a professor name that you know exists in your WordPress. All right, and if I go ahead and save this and then refresh Postman, perfect. We see that that S argument, S for search, is doing its job. Except we don't actually want to hard code the keyword here in this PHP file, right? Because you and I, as the developers of this site, we are the only ones that have access to type in a new phrase here. So instead of hard coding a value here, what we want to do instead is we want to make our API URL flexible. And what I mean by that is we want to be able to add on parameters at the very end of the URL. So for example, at the end of this URL, we should be able to add on a question mark and then say term equals barks a lot. There's nothing special about the word term, I just made it up. You could instead say keyword equals barks a lot or phrase equals barks a lot. The name of the parameter doesn't matter. The key point here is that we want to be able to use this value, whatever gets passed at the end of the URL here, we want to be able to use that within our custom query. We want to set it as the value for the S or search argument. Now, luckily, WordPress makes it very simple for us to access this data, or these parameters. So check this out. Back in our code, remember when we ran this function named register rest route? This is where we chose the namespace for our URL and the route name. And perhaps most importantly, this is where we chose which function we want to use to return relevant data. Well, when WordPress runs this callback function that we list here, it passes along a bit of data about the current request that someone is sending. And we can access that data that WordPress is sending along by simply adding a parameter name within the definition of this function down here. Within these parentheses, let's just add a parameter. Let's call it data, but you could call it whatever you want. The idea though is that now we can use this parameter anywhere within the body of this function. So down here, instead of hard coding the search value to barks a lot, instead let's just say data. And what this is an array that WordPress puts together. And within this array, we can access any parameter that someone adds on to this URL. So for example, in this case, we said term equals barks a lot. So you could think of this as term is the property and barks a lot is the value. So back in our code, in order to access that term property, we could just say data and then look inside the array with square brackets and then just quotes and the name of the property. So look inside the array for term, which will obviously give us a value of barks a lot. Or instead, if someone said sky color equals blue and grass color equals green, well, in that case, you could access the value of blue by saying sky color, just look inside the array, or you could access green by saying grass color. Okay, the point that I'm trying to drive home here is we are in complete control of the naming scheme here. So let's set this back to term. And now if I save this, and then back in Postman, if at the end of our URL, right, WP-JSON University v1 search, if I add on and say $term equals Meowsalot, or the name of another professor that you have, as soon as I send that off, whoops, looks like we've got an error here. I think I know what the problem is. Back in our code, we definitely do not want a semicolon here at the end of this line. So that was my mistake. Let's get rid of that semicolon, because when you're creating an array, you just add a comma in between each item, not a semicolon. And you don't need anything after the final item in an array. So let's go ahead and save this again. And if we give Postman another try, perfect. We only see the Dr. Meowsalot post because we passed along a search term value of Meowsalot. Now, before we move on any further, I want to cover a quick security note. So back in our code, WordPress already performs its own security checks when you run a search. That's why you can't just visit any WordPress website in the world and immediately hack it with a SQL injection just by searching the website. However, having said that, it never hurts to be extra careful. So whenever you're writing your own custom code and you need to work with input that a random visitor from the web is typing in, you always want to be sure to sanitize that input. So if, for example, someone tried to pass along in this URL, they said term equals, and then instead of Meowsalot, they typed in some malicious code. Well, back in our code, let's just wrap this within a WordPress function named sanitize text field. Okay, so this is a WordPress function, so let's just cut and paste the term that we are looking for. Let's just move it to live within the parentheses of this sanitize function. Okay, so if I save this and then test it out again, maybe if I search for Froggerson, cool, things still work. We see Dr. Froggerson, and now we are just a little bit more secure. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we will learn how to return data for all post types instead of only the professor post type. And once we have that up and running, then everything will really come full circle. And we can start working on the display for our search overlay, where we output general information from posts and pages, and then programs and professors, and then finally campuses and events. This is where things really start to come together, and it should be a lot of fun to build out. So let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson.